Early game maps in Fire Emblem have historically been pretty hit or miss for me. Lots of games like Fire Emblem 7 are criticized for lengthy, boring tutorials, while other games such as Sacred Stones just have really uninteresting to play early games on subsequent playthroughs. With that in mind, I thought I would look at a few early game maps that I really like and talk about why. Before we get into it though, a big thank you to my patrons, Ike Poo, Lucy Sev, Danny Doyle, Helix, and Acrobatic Jazz. Your support is deeply appreciated, and if you want to support the channel and get early access to videos, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. So, before we look at a specific map, I just want to talk about what makes a good early game map in general. To me, an early game map should have two main goals: teach new players something about the game, and scale gracefully with difficulty to challenge experienced players. Or, in the case of older games that don't have multiple difficulty settings, at least provide something interesting for more experienced players to sink their teeth into, even if they don't need the lessons the map is teaching. To start with, let's look at one of my favorite first maps in the series, that being the one that started it all, Chapter 1 of Fire Emblem 1. It's a pretty straightforward map, but it does a lot of things right. For one thing, there's a little bit of distance between you and the enemies. It's not a ton of space, so an experienced player can walk towards the enemies and get into the action quickly, but new players will have a whole 2 turns to play around with moving their units, managing items, and experimenting with terrain before they have to do significant combat. Especially for the first game in the series, I think that's nice. Second, we immediately learn about how villages work on this map. We see a thief destroy the village to the south, which clues us in that for the rest of the game, villages are going to be in danger if we don't get moving to save them. And there's a village for us to visit right next to us that shows us what kind of resources we can get from them. In this case, the village just gives us gold, and there's a vendor right next to it to teach us what that money is good for. Another neat thing about this map is that none of your units start out with any vulneraries or healing items. And this may sound like a weird thing to praise, but I like the effect that it has on this map. Without vulneraries, you have a few options for how to approach the map. You can make heavy use of Jagen, who's pretty durable. You can use a large variety of your units so that nobody takes too much damage, or you can make use of the forts on the map that allow your units to regain some health at the start of each turn. All of these outcomes are good. If you use your Jagen, great, you've learned that Jagen's durability is a boon and that you should take advantage of it. If you spread the damage out amongst your units, also great, you've gotten a little taste of what each unit can do and what the differences between them are. And finally, if you used the forts to regain health, that's good too. Now you know how terrain works, and you probably even did some combat while standing on one, so you know how terrain can impact combat as well. The lack of healing items also helps you understand how valuable the new recruit is on this map. Towards the end of the map, there's another village where we get our first staffer, Riss. And if we didn't spend a lot of time sitting on forts, our units are probably going to be pretty beat up, and the value of staffing becomes immediately obvious as Riss can get your units back into shape to fight the boss. After going through the whole map without vulneraries, Riss feels like a godsend for being able to heal your guys back up. Riss also teaches us that there can be optional objectives on maps that add units to our army. This is reinforced in the end of map dialogue where an NPC explains that you'll be able to recruit more characters throughout your journey, just like you did with Riss. All of these things are things that new players will almost certainly notice on a first playthrough, but there's a couple other subtle things that they may or may not notice. First, a new player may notice that there are some enemies able doubles with a sword that Kain doesn't, and neither of them double anything with a lance. If they investigate a bit, there are 2 things a player may infer from this. 1, that with enough speed you can attack enemies twice, and 2, some weapons are harder to double with than others. Players may also notice a difference between Kain's lance and Abel's javelin, namely that the lance is a bit more accurate. This may clue players in that usually the cost of 1-2 range for a physical weapon is a loss of damage and accuracy. So lots of little takeaways on this map, and delivered in a way that allows new players to take a couple turns to get their bearings, while experienced players can charge right into the action. Before I move on to another map, I also want to touch on the 2 other versions of this map. The map was remade in Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, as well as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. A lot of my praise for the map remains the same, but in Mystery of the Emblem there are a few different takeaways players might have from the map, and in Shadow Dragon we get to see what this map would look like with multiple difficulty settings. Let's start with Mystery of the Emblem, where there are a few new things a player might notice while playing this map. One is that your cavaliers have swords but can't use them at first. This is our introduction to the dismount mechanic. A player will see the dismount option every time they move a cavalier, and as soon as they click it, they'll see that they can use swords. And even more than that, they'll see that they double with swords but not with lances. This might get you thinking about weapon weight, and then you might notice that Jagen can double enemies with Sita's Slim Lance, and that Sita can double with the Silver Lance. There's lots of little considerations on this map that players may or may not notice, but that provide a fun opportunity for optimization for experienced players. I felt pretty big brain when I realized that Slim Lance on Jagen is a good choice for this map. At the very least, players are likely to get a taste of the dismount mechanic and the difference between swords and lances. In Shadow Dragon, this map plays out similarly to other versions of the map on lower difficulties, though it is worth knowing that in normal mode there is a full-length tutorial in this game, so some of the lessons one might learn on this map become redundant in that context. Still, on hard 1 or higher, it remains a good introduction to the game. What's interesting to look at here, though, is how the map is on higher difficulties, since that's the main new thing here. On hard 5, this map is a pretty tough intro. Enemies can take your units out in a few hits, and none of your units can one-round. So the difficulty demands that you make smart use of your units, and the value of a bow unit that doesn't take a counterattack feels more apparent here than in FE1, where some of your units could take as little as 1 damage from the pirates. The only real criticism I have of this map in Shadow Dragon is that on hard 5 the boss is pretty rough. He has crit on most of your units, and your units do pretty middling damage to him. He even doubles some of your units. It's to the point where a common strategy to avoid having to deal with incidental crits from the boss is have him slowly break his weapon on your highest luck unit. So I think this boss could stand to be a little weaker. It isn't particularly interesting to fight him. Alternatively, a save point near the boss would have made the boss less frustrating and also introduced a new mechanic for Shadow Dragon in the mid-map save points. If you've played GBA Fire Emblem, you may have noticed that a lot of what I praised for all the versions of this map also applies to the first map of Fire Emblem 6, and there's a good reason for that. Structurally, these maps are pretty similar. Look at how similar they are if we just rotate one of the maps 90 degrees. The main difference is that the FE6 map moves the destroyed village to the top of the map and doesn't have a recruitable character or vendor. But a lot of the same concepts are taught on both maps, so I'm not going to go into detail on this FE6 map, but it's great, and I just wanted to note that it's great because it's for a lot of the same reasons that I like this FE1 map. Okay, so that was a good early game map, but now let's look at an early game map I don't like as much. I love singing the praises of Sacred Stones, but the first few chapters kinda suck. The prologue is a 3-enemy map designed to just teach you how to attack and move, basically, and while this map is over quick, I think it's a bad way to do this sort of tutorial. I don't really think people need a whole map or a handheld tutorial to figure out how to attack. At some point, even someone that has never played video games before will put their unit next to another unit and notice that they can attack. At the very least, even if you think an explicit tutorial is necessary for teaching attacking, it doesn't need to be its own map. Something else that hurts FE8's early game is that Seth is just so incredibly dominant. In FE1, Jagen doesn't one-shot much, and if you have him fight everything, he does take a lot of damage. So there's incentive to think a bit and make use of your other units. In FE8, Seth being so good means that just moving him towards the enemies alone is a viable solution until maps start having multiple paths where units want to go, which doesn't really happen until Chapter 4 or 5. I don't think Chapter 1 of Sacred Stones would be great even without Seth, but with him there's not a ton to learn here besides that Seth is really good. Though, I guess that is a valuable lesson for beating Sacred Stones. These early game maps do teach you the very basics of Fire Emblem, but that's all they teach you, and they don't really test what you've learned much. As a result, I think these maps fail to teach you more than other early game maps, but also become boring on replay, if they're even interesting the first time. The gameplay doesn't start to really open up and become interesting until Chapter 5, and the early game maps are at least quick, but 4 unengaging maps to start the game isn't great. In contrast to Sacred Stone's early game maps, Fire Emblem Engage has one of my favorite examples of an early game map that is both fun and teaches you a lot without being too heavy-handed in Chapter 4. This map introduces a few things commonly introduced in other games like villages, but what I really like about this map is how it teaches you to use 2 different emblem rings. This is the first chapter where the player has access to the Sigurd and Celica rings, and the way the map is structured provides obvious use cases for them that teaches you what the emblems are good for. The premise of this map is that the bulk of your army, including your 2 new emblems, start in the bottom left of the map. Closer to the top right are your 2 new units, the Armor Knight Louis and the Pegasus Knight Chloe. The immediate problem that this map presents is that you want to bring your units from the bottom left to go support your new units before they can be overwhelmed by the enemies near them. Our new emblem rings provide 2 great ways to do that. First, the Celica ring that comes on Saline has the Warp Ragnarok ability. which allows its user to warp to a different location and attack an enemy. So at any time, you can warp Cerales over to help out your new troops. I think this is the best tutorial on using warp that the Fire Emblem series has ever had. Most Fire Emblem games either don't teach you to use warp, or struggle to overcome the barrier that it can be difficult to encourage players to use heavily limited resources like warp. In Engage, warp being attached to a ring that doesn't have to deal with limited durability allows the designers to build maps that encourage you to use it. This in turn makes players a bit more comfortable with warp before they introduce the warp and rewarp staves a little later in the game. The Sigurd ring similarly makes a great first impression in this map. Much like Cerales can warp to your allies quickly, using the Sigurd ring allows your Sigurd user to get around the map quickly, and there's a couple possible use cases for it. Your Sigurd user could grab the village at the bottom and then use the Sigurd ring to catch up to your army, or you could rush your Sigurd user ahead to provide relief to Chloe and Louis as soon as possible. Either way, you'll also appreciate the extra defense from the Sigurd ring since your Sigurd user may be off on their own for a bit. What I love about this map is that it doesn't have to be too explicit in telling you how to use the rings. The furthest the map goes is Cerales mentioning that she can use Celica to help her friends out quicker. The challenge the map presents shows an obvious use case for the rings, and the player is left to figure out the best way to use them. I've watched a lot of new players try this map, and usually they figure this out pretty quickly and feel clever when they do. Even better, sometimes players even do it a little differently. Some players warp immediately, some people use Cerales for combat in the bottom left for a couple turns and then warp. So players get to think about how best to use the tool, but either way they learn how to use warp. It's a lesson learned in an interesting way, and that's what early game maps should be aiming for. Beyond teaching you how to use the rings, the map also gives a great first impression of your new units and shows you what they're good for. There's an archer that's dangerous to Chloe but can be easily handled by Louis, and mages that Louis struggles with but Chloe can handle, so we can immediately see some use cases for these units. Louis is great when physical bulk is valuable, and Chloe can cover his weakness against magic using enemies and fly over terrain as needed. And these lessons will be reinforced throughout the game, as many of the maps that immediately follow have use cases for Sigurd's movement, Celica's warp, Louis' bulk, or Chloe's flyer utility. But the beautiful thing about this map is even if you don't need the lessons, it's still fun. When I played the map for the first time, I didn't really need the lessons the map was teaching, but it was still fun figuring out the best way to use the Sigurd and Celica ring. I think this map works well for new players and veterans alike. So far, I've only talked about how early game maps can teach you mechanics and still be fun, but something a little less tangible is how early game maps can help set the tone for the rest of the game. Let's take a look at the first chapter of Thracia 776. In most Fire Emblem games, you kick off the game by fighting bandits, or you're part of a noble army fighting a rival kingdom. But Thracia is a little different. In this map, we're fighting soldiers, but there's a few things that make it stick out. First, not only are we not fighting bandits, the bandits are on our side, which immediately tells you that this game is going to be a little different than most Fire Emblem games, and puts a bit more emphasis on common people and Leaf's relationship and responsibility to them as a noble. This is reinforced when the game introduces capture, our main tool for getting weapons and money. For most of the game, we won't be getting cash influxes from villages or kingdoms. Instead, we're an underdog. We need to scrounge by on what we can salvage from our enemies. I like this map for how it provides a sandbox for new players to learn mechanics, but what I really like about it is how it sets the tone and atmosphere for Thracia. Since early game maps are the first thing players see when they try a Fire Emblem game, they have a unique opportunity to introduce players to the universe and story. So to me, the best early game maps are ones that teach the players the mechanics of the game in an interesting way, and remain engaging on subsequent playthroughs or on higher difficulties. And even better is if they provide a strong introduction to the story and atmosphere of the game. So those were some of my favorite early game maps, but what early game maps do you like the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you liked the video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. If you want to chat about Fire Emblem more, check out the community Discord linked in the video description. Either way, thanks for sticking around, and have yourself a lovely week.